Evet, hepiniz tekrar hoş geldiniz. Bugünkü son konuşmacı oturumumuzda DigiPen Institute of Technology kıdemli eğitmeni Sonia Michaels bizle olacak. Kendisi yeni nesil oyun geliştiricilerinin yetenekleri, ilgi alanları ve önceliklerini anlamak ve bu gelen grubun çalıştıkları şirketleri ve ürettikleri oyun türlerini nasıl etkileyeceğine dair içgörü kazanmaktan bahsedecek bize. Şimdi kendisini davet ediyorum. Hi Sonia.
Hello.
Welcome, and it's really nice to meet you.
Thank you so much. It's very nice to meet you too. Let me know when I should share my screen and start talking.
Yeah, of course, you can share your screen when you are ready. I gave you the permission. Okay,
Wonderful. Thank you.
we can see it now. So I'll be here if you need any help.
Okay, well, let's hope I can get this right, and hopefully you can all see my screen. And I'm here to talk to you about the next generation of game developers, because I'm an educator, which means that that I see the next generation about 4 or 5 years before anyone else does. If you do have questions, I do have the question box open, so please feel free to ask questions. I talk pretty quickly, and so I will try to slow myself down a bit, but let's slow me down if anybody needs to. So, okay, so I'm Sonia Michaels, and I teach in the Humanities and Social Sciences Department at the DigiPen Institute of Technology in the Seattle area in Washington State. And I've been teaching for a very long time, since about 1989. And I started teaching game developers specifically in 2008. So it's been a little while. And of course, I've been playing games forever, since I was about 12 years old, playing Pong and Pac-Man and Space Invaders and so on. I'm currently on the IGDA, International Game Developers Association Board of Directors. And I have taught members of pretty much every generation that is out there right now. Generation X, which is my own, millennials, Generation Z, and even some older people who were returning back to school. And so I've also worked as a consultant and an editor and worked with people from around the world. So my experience crosses over cultural boundaries in many ways. And so the things I want to talk about today is, first of all, how we get past the stereotyped ideas that people have of what a generation is like. These people are like that. These people, all of that. And then to talk about the impact of this next generation on the game industry, because I think that big change is coming to the industry, and that they will, this next generation will be making a lot of this change happen, and it's important change, and we will talk about that. And then also because for many people will be hiring young developers, working alongside them, putting together teams. What do we need to know about them in a professional sense? And so the question, is it even important to think about generations? I think it is, but you can't get too tied up in it, because that is dangerous if you end up in a place where you stereotype every different group of people. So for pretty much forever, people have been complaining about anyone who is younger than them. And so, this quote that I have here is something getting closer to 3,000 years old. I see no hope for the future of our people if they are dependent on the frivolous youth of today, for certainly all youth are reckless beyond words, and so on. Every generation gets frustrated with the generation that is coming up below it, and thinks that they are all disrespectful, reckless, they don't listen, they don't learn, and so on. And of course, this is not a great attitude if you're going to be working closely with people and interacting with them on a regular basis. So people are people, absolutely, but our experiences form us very differently. And these can include like major world events that have an impact on everyone, or major national events, big technology change, the internet, and things like that. But of course, people are also influenced on a much more micro level by their, their culture of origin, their family, the way their family works, whether they grew up, whether they are a man or a woman. All of these things have an impact on who somebody becomes. And so there is an intersection there where the big things that define a generation give way to the smaller things that are a matter of individual personality and history and so on. So I think that every generation comes with stereotypes, and some of them are good and some of them are bad. And so these are roughly the numbers, the years that define each generation. And of course, this is not solid. This is, this changes back and forth. So the generation that I'll be talking about today is Generation Z. I didn't choose the names. It's just that that's what it ends up being called. And that's the generation born between 1997 and 2015. And I have a daughter who was born in 1997. So she is one of my experts on her generation, along with all of my hundreds of students that I have and that I talked to for making this presentation. So some of these stereotypes can be really negative. People tend to think that the baby boomers are afraid of technology. They don't understand the world. They tend to think that my generation are lazy, cynical, pessimistic, and so on. They think that millennials are spoiled and eat avocado toast all the time, and and so on. And they think that Generation Z are fragile and kind of empty-headed, that they care about TikTok more than they care about anything else. And so you will find people like this, but you will also find many people who are not, because every generation is made up of individual voices, not one single voice. And so please don't think that I am trying to push an entire generation together. I'm going to talk about tendencies that I've been noticing, that my colleagues have been noticing, and so forth. So why do we need to care about this? Because Generation Z has 2.5 billion people in it, out of the 7.7 billion total that there are on the world right now, as of last year. This is last year's statistic. So they make up about 30% of the world's population, which means that in 10 years, they will be 1/3 of the people in the workforce. So I understand that the game industry in Turkey is fairly focused on indie games, which means that, the people running indie game studios are often, in their 30s, 40s, and so on. And so pretty soon, though, we will all be working with younger people in their early to mid 20s as they come out of their education and go into their careers. So this generation, they are the first true digital natives, which means that they do not remember there is pretty much nobody in this generation who remembers life before there was a touch screen, before there was an iPhone or a tablet. They've been using technology for the entire length of their human memory. And in this generation, when they have the access to technology wherever in the world they are, people tend to be comfortable using 5 different screens: the smartphone, the tablet, the desktop, the laptop, and sometimes the TV. This generation is also, around the world, the most educated generation ever. They are more likely to pursue post-secondary education, college and university, than any generation before them. They also tend to be very socially aware and active and involved. They are the people who will donate, they will volunteer, they will protest. And so this is a marker of the generation that I think will be really important as we move forward into the next few decades. And so some of the things that we are noticing in our classrooms with our students is that, and this is the best part, this is the interesting part, that our students don't just want to learn how to make games anymore. Yes, they have to learn game design and programming and 2D, 3D character art and so on, but they also have an interest in a lot of other things. And when I joined DigiPen, I was nervous because I thought, oh goodness, all of these students want to make games and they'll think, why do I have to take an English class? Why do I have to take a communications class? And yet we've found that students lately, especially in the past 5 or 6 years, are really, really interested in learning more about human psychology and sociology, the way that people work together. They're interested in history and literature, and they're building games based on mythologies, ancient mythologies from many different parts of the world. They're very interested in story and narrative. So that means that they're interested in a wider range of games than people might expect from people who are 18, 19, 20 years old. They are really interested in leadership and management, and they will come to me and ask me to recommend books for them to read about workplace, group dynamics, and books like The Culture Code or about salary negotiation. They want all of this knowledge in ways that I didn't notice until a few years ago, that it just wasn't happening. They were saying, just let me make the games, okay? And now they want to know all of this other stuff. They're interested in data and research. And DigiPen, where I teach, we're opening up a research lab that will be for UX, user experience and psychology research. And the students are really, really excited about that. And so we find that this is an important shift because it really will affect the creativity and the ideas that these young people put in to the games that they create and the work that they do. And we do see them applying it directly. Usually in the past, our students have been, okay, the producer, the artist, the designer. Now they are getting much more detailed and specific with this. So they will say, yes, one of our team members is our user experience researcher, and they will do play tests and collect data and so on in a way that they didn't before. They were much more focused on the just let me learn how to do the thing and get out. But now they want to know about all this other material. They will often come to us and say, can you please play through our game? Can you read through our dialogue and talk to us, give us some feedback and critique? And so that's outside their game-focused classes. That's outside the programming and design. They're coming to their English teachers and their psychology professors to say, please help us make this better. And that's one of the things that I find most exciting and most encouraging about this young generation. So they also are very socially involved, and they care about diversity and inclusion. And for the first time, about a year ago, I was talking in class, and it makes me nervous to talk about diversity because it is a topic that can be controversial. But I have lectures, and I went in and talked about it. And one student raised his hand and said, "You just said Gamergate. What is that?" And that made me so happy because what it meant was that the students coming into us now were too young 7 or 8 years ago to really understand everything that happened during Gamergate. And so we, educators and industry peers, have the opportunity to reshape that and represent it to our students accurately, instead of having to undo damage that has previously been done by stuff that people have read on Reddit or 4chan or wherever they are reading. And so that is a really important change. I think that this next generation is ready for a fresh start when it comes to a lot of the negative things that have happened in the industry over the past few years. We've also noticed something very cool, which is that our students are really interested in accessibility. Again, previous generations were more focused on how do we make this game really challenging, really hard. But now our students are realizing that not everybody can play every game on the really hard setting. And that sometimes for people who have difficulties with their eyes or with their hearing or using their hands, there are ways that they can design their games and the software and the hardware to make life easier and to include people who couldn't have played before in playing the games. And I think this is one of the most wonderful things that I've seen, is that our students are bringing me a document and they're saying, I chose these colors because I know that some people can't see red or green the way I do. And so this is why I chose these colors. And so that level of thoughtfulness and consideration is one of the things that makes me the most happy about this incoming generation. They also care very much about things like, inclusive character creation, where you can make a character, you can make your avatar in a game look as much like you as possible. And so my students were sending around petitions for people to sign to make Animal Crossing, to get Nintendo to put different hairstyles and skin tones into Animal Crossing. And so these are the things that they care about, again, which makes me really happy, because a lot of the work I do is in the area of diversity and inclusion. And it is wonderful to see students who care about other people so very much. They also care about mental health and disability issues, partly because they are very open about their own mental health challenges. And it used to be that, nobody talked about being depressed or being anxious or going to therapy. But now this generation is very, very excited about talking about, hey, this thing that my therapist told me, it might help you too. And so that is also good to see. But again, of course, there's a cultural aspect to that. Not all world cultures are comfortable with the idea of, therapists or mental illness and so on. But where we are, and with the students that I have, who, come from a variety of places around the world. I have a lot of students from obviously the US, but also from Thailand and Singapore. And I've had students from Egypt and, many different places around the world. And I've noticed that the conversations are different than they used to be around mental health issues. And that these students are they're very open and willing to say to me, I really want to come to class today, but I'm feeling really bad. Could I please have a mental health day? And for me, I know some people who say, no, you just come to class. But for me, if somebody is showing the self-awareness to say, I could come to class, but I'm not going to really be there, I'm not going to be a good student in class today, then I want to honor that and allow them to take the class to do what they need to take care of themselves. But students never asked that before. And now in the past few years, they are much more open about this. Something else that I will be talking about more in detail later is that we have more students in our classes who are on the autism spectrum, ASD, autism spectrum disorder. And I want to talk about this because it's something that I think most people didn't really see or think about a generation ago, because those students didn't get the support they needed in their early school when they were 7, 8, 9 years old. And so without that support, they never went to college because the world gave up on them. But now that students are getting younger and younger support, we have more college students who are on the autism spectrum, which means that in a few years, you will have more colleagues and employees and peers who are also on the autism spectrum. And I want to talk about that because it's really important, and there are a lot of misunderstandings about it, but I will get back to that later. More good things about this generation is that they are very compassionate. We have had student game teams in the past few years make games for the Make-A-Wish Foundation, which is when a child has cancer or is very sick and they want something special. And our students took their little comic book drawings and turned them into a game. And that was something very rewarding and very kind and caring. And this generation really wants positive change in the world for themselves, for the people who will play their games and read their stories and so on. And this is why I'm very hopeful that they will bring a lot of positive change to the game industry as they enter it and as they build their careers and their influence grows and they move forward. A few things that you may have noticed is that Generation Z loves the phone, but they hate talking on the phone, to the point that they will ignore every call. I was out driving last week with my husband and my daughter, and my husband's phone rang and he answered it, And my daughter looked at me and said, "Why does he do that? Who answers the phone anymore?" And I said, "Old people." But they don't want to talk on the phone. They'll do everything else on the phone. They'll log into Teams for their classes, and they'll write notes and essays and so on. But they do prefer text-based communication channels, which is why it's such a great thing that Discord and Slack exist for communication, among people who work on games together, and that is becoming the industry standard, basically. The other thing that we've found is that this generation is very, very informal, which means that I will sometimes get emails that say, "Hello, Professor Michaels," and sometimes I'll get emails that say, "Yo, Sonia, how you doing?" And I have to take a minute and think, okay, they're not trying to be rude. This is how they talk. They're speaking to me as they would, write to a friend. And so I just need to gently model that if you're writing a professional email, it should probably be a little bit more formal than that. The next generation coming in, Generation Z, also gave up on email a little while ago. They will use email for school and for work, but they would really rather just stay on Discord and Slack and chat there. And they're not as obsessed with social media as everyone thinks, but when they do use social media, it's Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat still, sometimes, but it's not Facebook. They gave up on that a while ago. There are some definitely strange things about the incoming generation. And again, it's something that as educators and as colleagues and employers, it's good to kind of reshape the way we think to include this stuff. And that this generation, so we're talking people who are, teenagers and in their early 20s now, will have entire conversations that are just memes. Somebody will send somebody else a SpongeBob meme, and somebody will send somebody else, and these conversations don't even have to have words. Everybody understands what's going on, and it's like a new shared vocabulary that the generation has. And the millennials have some of this, but Generation Z has taken this up to the very next level. The other thing I've noticed, and this whole slide, I showed it to about 7 or 8 students and my daughter and a few friends in that age group, and they all said everything on this slide is true. There are no lies here. And so there is this thing that they do where they will say everything is, they say everything much larger. That cat is so beautiful. I will kill everything I love and set the world on fire because I love your cat so much. And for older people, that can sometimes be a little bit disconcerting. Or when somebody says, if I don't get that that dress, I will just kill myself. And so of course, for the older generation, this is terrifying. And for the younger generation, this is the way that they are talking. I think there are also major differences in what people find funny from generation to generation. And I know that a lot of tension between generations has to do with the type of humor that is acceptable. And when I say on this slide, humor that punches up is better for this generation, what that means is that you are making jokes about people who have more power instead of punching down by making jokes at the expense of people who will feel less power or be hurt by these jokes. And so for the generation, the baby boomers and Gen X grew up with jokes like, "Your mother is so fat," things like that. Generation Z finds those jokes horrifying because they are hurtful to people. And so sometimes there's very interesting shifts in humor between generations, which of course means that a lot of people end up in fights with their older family members because somebody told a joke and it wasn't good. And the sense of humor is very dark and kind of absurd. Like I'm going to show you a joke now. It's not a joke, it's a meme. But I asked my teaching assistant, she's 22 years old, and I said, give me the most representative Generation Z image, meme, joke, whatever you can. And this was what she sent me. And I showed it to 6 or 7 different people, and they were all like, yep, that's it. That is Generation Z. So it is hard to, to pull meaning out of this. It's a, Korean pop singer holding a sign, big smile, and I love suffering. And yet this is this is apparently the best Generation Z joke ever. So I am perhaps too old to entirely get it, but I do understand the type of humor that that this is coming from. And so, this means that a lot of things are going to change in conversations, in narrative and dialogue, and in the way we present things that are supposed to be amusing or funny. A lot of people think that Generation Z is weak and fragile, but honestly, I haven't seen that much of that. I've seen that this generation has had to deal with a lot of trauma and bad things in many cases, but they do bounce back. They are very, very resilient. And I am very impressed by that. The one thing I have noticed, though, is that no matter how brilliant and talented they are, sometimes they have trouble, like, actually living like adults. They might be the most amazing designer or programmer in the world, but they can't do their own laundry. And so this is one of those things that is interesting about this generation. And a friend of my daughter's said to me the other day that he finished college and he got his life together, and he said, I can go into a room and make anyone like me, but I can't take care of myself. And so that's an interesting fact also about many people in this generation of young people. So that's all great, but what do you need to know to work with people? That's, a large part of why I'm here. And I think this is important, that the industry is changing. And if you've been in the game industry for any time at all, you know that it has problems, that it is not all perfect, bright, beautiful, sunshiny, that there is a lot of problematic behavior. There are a lot of unhealthy ways that people are treated at work. And you know that the game industry exploits people's passion. People love games, they want to make games. And so the industry says, okay, you can come and make games, and you will have to do it for 80 or 90 hours a week for low pay, and be happy about it. And this is why game developers burn out so early. And the average career, if you look at all the state of the industry surveys over the past few years, the average game developer career is about 10 years. And it's less than that if you are a woman or an ethnic minority. It's about 5 to 7 years if people are lucky, because the atmosphere and the environment can be really negative. The industry still ignores toxic behavior and sometimes rewards it. People get to keep their jobs even when they have said or done terrible things to the people who work with them and for them. And the game industry is still far too centered on the United States. It is a world industry, but it is very US centric. And I think that it will be hard to achieve real sort of global equality across the industry until they move the Game Developers Conference out of San Francisco. Because, when the world opens up again and conferences start up again, it's going to be just as expensive as it always was to get to San Francisco and to stay in San Francisco and to get visas, all of this. And I think that this is one of the things holding the industry back, is that we need to spread the love around and the conferences and all of that. And so with all of these problems in mind, I think that the incoming generational cohort is going to make a huge difference for good. And I think this is really, really important, is that we are having an entire generation of people coming into the industry who are ready to make the change that really, really needs to happen. And I think that's so important. So what do they want from the workplace? They don't like the idea of crunch. Those 80-hour weeks scare them. They do that at school, but they don't want to do that for their whole career. They haven't quite figured out yet how to make this change. Some of them are working for unionization. Some of them are trying to think of other ways that they could make things better. But when they figure it out, there is going to be big, big industry change. They're entrepreneurial. This generation is good at finding and making jobs for themselves, at side hustles, at making something and selling it online to pay for school, to make games, and so on. And many of them will have multiple career shifts, not just job shifts, but actually career shifts. I know people who have worked in the game industry and then left the game industry and become tattoo artists. There are many different things that people will do with their careers. And this generation is very interested in being lifelong learners. They don't think that once they finish school, that's the end of their education. They're always learning and they always want to be learning, which is why they're always asking me for book recommendations. In a workplace or a school environment, they very much appreciate being able to contribute, which means that some management structures will work better than others for them. So they like opportunities to say, hey, I have an idea. Even if the idea doesn't happen, it doesn't get made, it doesn't make it into the game, they still like to be consulted and they like people to listen to their opinions and value their input. And so it's a very sort of, you know, democratically minded generation in that sense. I see a question here. Is ignoring and rewarding these toxic behaviors usually in the USA? And are there any better and more ethical places? This is challenging because so much of it depends on personalities. And in the USA, there are some pretty bad things that have happened. I mean, if we look at fairly recent within the last few years, there's been problems with Riot, with Ubisoft, which is of course international. And I've noticed that there are some companies in England, in the UK, that are trying to shift things around. And, you know, with more or less success, it's hard to say because it sort of does weave throughout the industry. And I think there are some differences though, which is that the labor practices, the toxic exploiting labor practices, those are more worldwide. You know, we've seen people crunch their employees almost to death, you know, in everywhere from Poland to the US to wherever. And then there are some countries and cultures that have more problems with women in games, women in the industry, and you know that toxic behavior happens. And so it's hard to say. I'm hoping that as we move forward, that you know around the world that there will be positive change, but that will be hard. It'll be hard to make it happen until some people start to retire, until some of the people who are the worst are ready to retire and move on, and then people will be able to readjust the way that things run. And I'm happy to speak more to that later. Something that you will find if you are interviewing young game developers is that they will ask better questions. They will be, yes, they want the job, they're desperate for the job, but they will also be asking questions about culture fit and about crunch and about what are the working hours, how big is the team, how does the management structure work. They will be asking good questions because they have learned to care about this. They have learned to interview the interviewer in a way that I think a lot of people were previously very uncomfortable with. They will also be quite willing to get up and move to a different city, a different country. I have former students who have relocated 3 or 4 times in the first 5 years of their career. They go somewhere, they work for a while, they get laid off or the studio closes, they come back, they get a different job. And so there's, they're much more mobile. And of course, now they're very, very comfortable with remote work. It doesn't work for everyone. Not everyone is in a position or has the right temperament to stay remote all the time, but a lot of this generation will actually be quite comfortable with it because of the combination of their technological understanding and the past year of everyone's life. They are now in a position where they understand how to work remotely as well as they do how to work in person. This is where I'm going to go off on a detour for the next 4 or 5 slides, because one of the things that is happening is that just as we are encountering more people who are neurodiverse which means on the spectrum, attention deficit disorder, autism, things like that. Again, as they finish college and move into the world, these will be the people who are applying for jobs. And so I want to do a little detour about this because I think it's really, really important. And I know that this is one of those things that there is still some catching up to do, in the world around disability and neurodiversity. And so, I mean, neurodiversity basically means that, there are many people in the world whose brains work differently than neurotypical people, the thing that we used to call normal, but, the word normal sounds so judgy. And so, there's neurotypical and there's neurodiverse. And over the past 10 to 15 years, we've noticed that there are many, many more students in our classrooms who are neurodiverse and who have certain accommodations that they need from us in the way that we teach and in the expectations that we have of them. And so we have adjusted for that. And as we have adjusted for that, I think that the world, the career world is also going to adjust for that, because otherwise they would be missing out on a big talent pool. Like, there are a lot of incredibly talented, brilliant young game developers who are also on the spectrum, neurodiverse, and so on. And so these aren't new conditions. And I think the main difference is that now children with autism or attention deficit disorder are getting enough support in the early years that they make it to college and they make it through college. And then when they try to get into the workforce, this can still be challenging for them because people are still catching up with how this works. And so I do think it's important to discuss this a little bit, because there used to be in most of the world shame around disability. And there still is in some communities and some segments of some communities, but there is also a worldwide movement toward supporting people who are, disabled or impaired in some way that, that is something that they can't control. And the World Health Organization estimates that about 1 out of every 270 people is somewhere on the autism spectrum. And so there are some autistic people who will never work. There are some autistic people who will never talk, but there are many, many people who are on that spectrum, but at the other end of it, and who might have some little, personal quirks, but given support and some accommodation, they will be the most amazing team members and employees and creatives ever. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the things to notice with that. Also a note that autism is diagnosed in boys 4 times more often than in girls. And in girls, it is usually diagnosed later because it looks different. It presents very, very differently. And so there will be a lot of students who, the guys knew they were autistic forever, and the girls didn't figure it out until they were 17 or 18 years old because nobody thought to test for it. Nobody thought about it. And so this is something that there are definitely gender differences in. And so one of the problems is that traditional recruiting doesn't allow people on the spectrum, ASD, autism spectrum disorder, to demonstrate their strengths, because they sometimes, again, this is not universal, but sometimes they don't interview well in the traditional sense. And so this makes it challenging, because one of the things that people like in interviews is, okay, I'm interviewing someone. Are they looking me in the eye? If they're not looking me in the eye, what does that mean? But eye contact can be very difficult for some people on the autism spectrum. And again, there are many, many differences. Not everyone will be the same way. But if you're interviewing someone and they seem to be really having trouble looking at you, they may or may not have told you that they are autistic, but that is one of the things that can make it difficult to for somebody to get through an interview. Sometimes people on the autism spectrum have difficulty understanding social cues, like, what am I supposed to do next? They don't perceive body language necessarily in the same way that we do. Like, when I'm interviewing, I can tell when somebody has had enough of my answer, because I can see them, they sit back or they stop making notes, or they look up from their notes and they look at me. And that to me is a signal that, oh, okay, they're done. And, this is something that for some people on the spectrum, they don't realize that. Sometimes there is not a filter around self-disclosure, which means that if you say, how are you today? They will tell you in great detail how they are today. And it's more detailed than maybe you're comfortable with. But again, that's because they're not getting those social cues. And sometimes they don't know when to stop answering a question. They don't know when the person is ready to move on. So this is something to note, that there are different ways to interview people. And there are some companies, including Microsoft, that have neurodiversity recruiting programs, so that people will be interviewed by those who understand what these differences might be and can get past that and on to the talents and skills of the person. And so, again, a reminder that diversity of all kinds makes a team better. Having women on your team, having neurodiverse people, having older and younger people will only make it'll only make your team better, having people from different, racial and ethnic backgrounds. And so this can only improve things. But there are, sometimes it is challenging to put together a really diverse team and to find the people that you want to hire and so on. But I know that people have preconceptions about autism, but many people on the autism spectrum are fantastic, creative minds, talented, brilliant people. And if you give them the chance, they will do amazing things for you, for your company, for for your teams. They think outside the box sometimes, and sometimes they're very good at detail oriented things that require a whole lot of focus, hyper focus, as it's called. And so there are many good reasons to hire for this sort of diversity. And sometimes people will need accommodations, but sometimes that is as simple as, can this person wear noise canceling headphones so that they don't get overwhelmed by the sensory overload that is going on around them? Sometimes it's, can they have their desk in a quiet corner instead of in the middle of the room where everyone is working together? You will often find that people on the autism spectrum need very clear directions. Like you would not say, oh, you should maybe think about doing something this way. You'd say, okay, I need you to do this way. And this is something that, again, once you get used to shifting that pattern, you will get the results you need. They will do things the way you need them to. There may be an awful lot of questions. One of the things I've noticed is that I've had to adjust my processes for communication in my classroom so that everybody gets a chance to speak, because sometimes the kids on the spectrum will be so super focused on the subject that they will go on for a very long time about it. And I have to make sure that I say gently to them, okay, thank you, Sarah. Now I'm going to let somebody else talk. And, these students don't take offense at that. They understand that you're just letting them know that it is now appropriate for them to stop talking. And this is something that you'll find in the workplace too. And you'll find that some students are very good at masking. They're very good at what some of them call acting normal, but that takes a lot of energy out of them. And so it's something that, can be exhausting, but many of them can do it. But again, remember, they're not just about their neurodiversity. They're about being talented artists and programmers and designers and all of that good stuff. So back to our regular programming. I think that managing people from Generation Z is going to be interesting. And again, I think that assembling diverse teams with people from different age groups is really important, because I think that older and younger people can learn a lot from working with each other. You will find that managing Gen Z employees has to be very interactive and hands-on, rather than handing them a document or sending them a document and saying, read this, that's your training. They prefer much more hands-on interactive training where somebody is working with them to show them how to do the things and so on. And also they respond well to positive reinforcement, which can also be a cultural thing. I understand that there are some cultures where, you tell people what they've done wrong because it doesn't, they don't need to fix what they've done right. But I have found that positive reinforcement works best with people of this generation. That doesn't mean empty praise all the time. It means reward good work and good suggestions and so on. And you will have employees who will be loyal to you forever. And of course, cross mentorship is great. You can put together somebody from Generation X with somebody from Generation Z, and they can teach each other a lot of things. But again, avoid the stereotypes. It's not that the young person has to teach the older person how to use the technology, as you all know, but it's worth mentioning, I think. So few final thoughts on this. And so even though no generation speaks with one single monolithic voice, I think there are enough similarities that it can be worth looking into them. It can be worth considering what experiences has this group of people had as they grew up in the world, wherever in the world they were. And, just basically, how do we integrate them together in a way that is positive and good for everyone? And we have a lot that we can teach the next generation. And when I say elders, yes, that's a joke, because I understand that the game industry is very young. I am the oldest person at any event I go to, at any game conference. But, you know, people in their mid-20s and 30s and 40s have a lot to teach the next generation, but they also have a lot to teach us about the change that is ahead. And I think if we can combine the experience that everyone who is already in the industry has with the fresh eyes of that next generation, with the people who look at the game industry and say, hey, that's messed up. This thing that is happening, why do you do that? Why do you work 90 hours a week? Well, because that's the way it is. No, that doesn't have to be the way it is. And so I think those fresh voices are going to make a huge difference to the industry in terms of positive change as we move forward, because the people who are coming into the industry aren't just conditioned to accept things the way they are actually conditioned to request and demand big change. And so I think that's the most important thing, is that I want us to call out the strengths, not the stereotypes, and to work across generations, you know, with as much goodwill as we can muster. And that is what I've got to say today. So thank you for listening to me, and I would be happy to answer questions. I see another question. You said that career lifetime in game developing is shorter. Is there any disadvantage to resume working after 10 to 15 years? I think that what it is that people just burn out faster. And I know that a lot of people, you know, when you are 21 years old, you can work 80-hour weeks for a good long time and you'll be okay. You won't be great, but you'll be okay. Then when you hit 30, or maybe you got married, maybe you have kids, you want to spend time with your kids, the game industry becomes punishing in terms of the time that it requires of people and the energy that it requires. And so I know many people who after that 10 or 15 years, they will leave, you know, they're maybe a game programmer, they'll leave games, they'll go work at Microsoft or Google because the money is better and the hours are better. And so I think that as we change industry working conditions, people will stay. You know, there are jokes. People joke that Valve Software is a retirement home for game developers because everyone who works there is like 40. But you know, I do think that once studios treat their employees better and create healthy harmony between, you know, work and life, I think careers will get much longer. That's something that I can see happening. Any more questions? And my contact information is here if anyone wants to send me an email or connect with me on Twitter as well.
Okay, I guess we don't have any more questions. So we have 1 more minute. So thanks a lot, Sonia, for joining, for sharing your experiences, for your presentation too. It's really nice. It was really nice to meet you.
It's been lovely to meet you and to be here. Thank you so much.
So we hope to see you again sometimes.
I would absolutely love that. And I know it is evening there, so everybody please have a good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.